It is November 1st, 2023. We would like to welcome you back to, believe it or not, there is going to be a second episode of Dennis and the Doc podcast by guys for guys.
The only sports
The
podcast.
only one. And today we're going to get into what will surely be a bit of a contentious topic. We're going to discuss our Big East preseason preview. We're going to talk about power ranking the teams. We're going to talk about new players and transfers into the conference. At the end, we're going to go through our picks for who's going to win awards this year, Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, all ones handed out by the conference. So, Mr. Dennis, before we start, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's almost hard to believe that we're actually doing another one of these, isn't it?
Yeah, this seems like I did in another life try to record a different podcast, but we did lose the audio to the first episode, and that was that. So
that may be kind of happening to one that we've already filmed, but hey, we actually got one out there, and that's further than I thought we'd make it. So
50%.
Glad to see some engagement, though. I think we got well over the 2 views that we expected to get, and I'm sure only half of it was us checking the view count.
Checking the view count, yeah.
But I figure we'll go in order of the teams as the way they were selected in the preseason poll by the coaches.
Okay.
So, which brings us to the first team we'll discuss is Marquette, picked to repeat and win the league by this year's coaches. Of course, they won the Big East regular season and the tournament last year. They went 17-3 in conference play, en route to a 29-7 overall record. They lost in the round of 32 to Michigan State out early, and they returned 4 of 5 starters. Mr. Dennis, when you look at this roster, what's the first thing that stands out to you?
The first thing that stands out, I mean, first of all, I agree with this ranking. Do you agree?
More or less. I mean, like, we'll get to this, but I have, like, 1A, 1B, 1C.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, yeah. Yeah, the first thing that stands out to me is no Omax, who did a lot for the team. We say 4 or 5 starters. And I know Kolek won Big East Player of the Year, but I think there's an argument to be made that Omax was every bit as valuable as he was last year. He did a lot of things defensively. He opened up a lot of things for them offensively, both scoring himself and creating for others. But it's a good roster.
It is. So we look down the list. Kolek, senior guard, 118 O rating last year. Cam Jones, junior, 115. Stevie Mitchell returning. He was, obviously the least heralded of the starting 5, but he still posted a 110. David Joplin will be taking a starting role this year, 6'8 junior. He's going to play the 4, 105 rating last year. And then Oso Ighodaro coming back to play the big. He was a 124 O rating last year, which is a huge number, and I think still would have put him 3rd amongst Big East centers. So kind of crazy to talk about that. 4 returners. So Mitchell averaged 23 minutes last year, Joplin 19, so not actually a huge drop-off between the two of them. They're returning the majority of their scoring, and looking at this bench, I think they're going to be a little bit deeper this year. The bench got a little bit older. Trey Norman, freshman, they've been talking about. I know they like what they're seeing from him so far. He kind of fits the Shaka Havoc guard mold a little better than maybe some of their previous bench players. So this is the one thing I'm a little bit interested in, though. The metrics don't love them as much this year as the other maybe top 2 in the Big East. Torvik has them 14th. Ken Pom has them 11th.
Still one spot ahead of Creighton.
But Torvik has us at 4, I think. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a drop off between Marquette's expectations from a purely analytical standpoint. They're projected to go 13-7 in conference play this year, 20-9 overall. Do you kind of agree with what you're seeing there? Is there a drop-off coming this year?
I think there is a little bit of a drop-off. You said 17-3.
Yeah, last year 17-3 in conference.
Yeah, I think that's going to be kind of hard to repeat. They got a lot of big wins on the road. I don't think they lost a home conference game.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Not important. Marquette famously will sort of take games off, and you saw that last year where they narrowly escaped St. John's. I think they narrowly escaped them twice. And one of the big things in the offseason they talked about last year was sort of a remade Shaka Smart offense. So I think getting a whole year to prepare for that and being able to expect a little bit more what Marquette's going to do on offense. I think a lot of people, you think of Marquette as and Shaka Smart, I guess, as a defensive-minded coach. What carried that team last year was the offense. They didn't play any defense, really.
Right.
But the offense carried them really hard. So I think record-wise, I think there's going to be a little bit of regression just because I think small wins in aggregate are kind of luck, and they had a lot of luck last year. But I think still a really good team, and they're still my pick to win the conference.
And it's, of course, that battle between luck versus you've got a player who can just go and get you wins. This is something we've talked about offline previously, that Kolek just is one of those guys that if he wants to hunt you down and go get a bucket or create for somebody else, he's going to be able to do it more often than not. So Omax is a big loss, for sure. And I think that's the point of attention this year is going to be how does Joplin step into that role? Because you lose a little bit of lineup versatility. He's not as athletic, not as explosive as Prosper. And now you're looking at a situation, too, where so your three guards are 6'3", 6'5", 6'3". Right, not small, but certainly not big, and you're talking about you're bringing 5'10" and 6'4" off the bench. Right, so there's not a whole lot of height there. None of those guards besides Mitchell can guard on the ball, Sean Jones can guard on the ball a little bit, but they'll be playing within a system D, and you figure they're going to mostly just try to outscore teams again this year.
Yeah, and they probably will.
And this is, I think, I am looking at this as a step back year for Kolek. I don't think he'll be as good as he was last year, but I'm not entirely sure that matters. Because what I mean to say is, he only went for 13 points a game last year, right? Not crazy, but he hit the big, he got into the lane and made things happen in big moments, right? 39% from three, but he didn't take a lot of them. So I could see him having a step back year, but at the same time, he averaged 7.5 assists.
Yeah.
Right? That's so off the radar that even if his scoring does take a hit, which it might, right? He's still going to create for other guys. It's just going to be a matter of if Joplin can step into that spot or not.
Yeah.
Because I think his best moments were in the Big East tournament, were down the stretch where he showed he is capable of slotting in. So it'll just be the question of how efficient he can be.
I mean, Joplin was really hit or miss last year. He had some games where he was the best player on the floor.
Yeah.
And he had some games where he took them out of a couple games. Yeah.
He frustrated UConn a lot in that Big East semifinal. Caravan wasn't getting out on him. Whoever they brought in off the bench to spare him wasn't getting out on him. And we talk about Marquette did play a lot of close games, but they were only 7-5 in games decided by 5 or less points, right? That doesn't jump off the page as, you were dominant in luck-based situations. The other thing that doesn't really jump off the page is their efficiency numbers. 140% shooter, Kolek at just sub 40, Jones at 36. Iguodaro hasn't shot a 3 in his college career. Stevie Mitchell doesn't shoot him. No one off the bench shoots him. They could be a team that struggles a little bit with offensive dimensionality, maybe is the right way to put it this year. Because Prosper was another guy who was big on the glass. They're not going to be getting as many second chance points this year.
Yeah.
All right, so that's Marquette. I think we both agree top 3, right? It's them or it's one of the other obvious teams, right? They're not.
I would go as far as to say they have the highest floor in the conference.
Okay.
I don't see a way they don't finish top 3.
I think I agree with that. Yeah. So we move on to our Creighton Blue Jays, who were picked second in the preseason poll. We can kind of skim through this a little bit since we talked about them so much in our last pod. Projected Torvik record 23-7, 14-6 in conference, finishing just behind UConn. Torvik has this as the second-ranked offense. Ken Pom has this as the 11th. Both agree that we're going to have a top 20 defense.
I would agree.
it's one of those things like you basically put your hand over all the names except Kalkbrenner, and that's where your top 20 defense is.
Yeah.
We talked about rim pressure, right? We talked about if we can score on 3 levels. So I was listening to the Nick Baugh podcast where he previewed our season, and he was talking about like where does Kalkbrenner get his lobs from this year? Like that's a quite like you factor in like 6-8 points a game off that, right?
Yeah.
Where someone's able to draw coverage and he can go get a bucket, because he's not really like a post down back to the basket kind of guy. He usually needs a little help getting his offense created. Is Ashworth going to be able to do enough on the drive? Can Trey do enough on the drive where he's getting those lobs?
So that's what I was going to say. Is I don't think you're going to see as many Ashworth to Kalkbrenner lobs as you saw last year with Nemhard. I think that's probably pretty well agreed upon. I do think you can have a lot more like Kalkbrenner slips where it's a bounce pass and a layup where it's not a lob. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same open shot of the basket. And as we kind of touched on earlier, it would not surprise me to see Trey with the ball in his hands more going downhill. And when you have the shooter of Ashworth that you can't help on, you put him on the wing and corner, you put Baylor on a wing and corner, even if we're going to see more Mason Miller minutes this year, I think that leaves a lot of room for Trey to get downhill and for Kalkbrenner to use lobs that way. So yeah, I'm not really worried about his scoring taking a hit. I think between Ashworth on like a slip type pass and Trey on a lob, I think he'll be fine.
Well, and I think you mentioned too, because if it is Trey a lot, the way to scheme out the lobs, the way to scheme out the roll part of the pick and roll is drop coverage, which is something we do so well. And something that, in theory, Trey is kind of the perfect guy to play against, right? Because he can knock down that mid-range if you're hesitant on whether you play him or not. If he's coming over the top and a guy's following him, he can step in and make that shot. Like, I remember R.J. Cole when he was at UConn. That's what we did to him to kind of take away Sonogo, take away UConn big. We'd play that drop coverage, kind of give him that 15-footer. And he was okay at making them, but at the end of the day, you're still coming out winning in that.
Yeah.
If they're not shooting 50% on it, Trey can, right? Like that's the difference. Is if teams play us that way, I think he can go and get some of those shots where Ashworth maybe has to kind of decide: does he try and stay around the arc, or does he try to penetrate and maybe get caught in the trees? You look at the efficiency numbers; they're really strong. So Ashworth was a 128 last year, O rating at Utah State. We talked about that, 20 points higher than Nemhard.
Yep.
And that's not one of those things where it's like, oh well, it's because he's playing, in a against worse opponents. No, it's really hard to get high O ratings if you're on a worse team, right,
yeah.
so to speak. Alexander a 112. Shireman was only a 108 last year, which I think is kind of surprising. Miller 107 in his limited time off the bench is actually a pretty surprisingly decent number when you consider how it felt when he was on the floor last year. Kalkbrenner 133, which is just off the charts.
Yeah.
The question's going to be the bench, and we know that.
Yeah.
So we'll mention now. We did a mailbag this week, and a couple of you submitted questions, so we'll answer one of them now. Seabesh is a UConn fan who Dr. Chim has had the pleasure of dealing with recently, and he asked the same question. They did the Big East preseason space the other day, and the question that came up was, the lack of depth is perceived. Is that perception warranted, and how worried are we about it?
I think it's completely warranted, honestly. Like, I don't know what you saw last year from anyone off the bench that makes you feel super confident. I think we agree Farabello might be better. Fred King is fine. But I think the style Creighton plays, you don't really need a ton of depth. I think it's one thing if you're like Houston basketball where you're getting up on teams, you're crashing the glass hard. There's a lot of room for fouls, like going for rebounds. You're playing big physical defense. Like Creighton isn't a get in your face, turn you over team. There's really hardly any times where anyone faces foul trouble. It's well documented how well Kalkbrenner stays out of it. It wasn't really an issue last. The only way depth I think is an issue is if one of the top four gets hurt. Yeah. And at that point, I think season's probably over anyways.
Right, and you say, like, how many teams would be in a
Yeah.
similar position? Like, UConn especially this year. Klingon goes down. I don't know. They can make that up. And that's even with, I know we don't necessarily think he's going to be what they think he's going to be this season. But, yeah, like the point is that other teams are in that position where, hey, you lose one of your best guys, you're in trouble anyways.
Yeah.
Right, so, like, I think Lawson potentially has a role on this team this year.
Yeah.
I think he's a guy you potentially look at if maybe Mason isn't working out come January. But yeah, it's definitely a concern. It's just going to be a matter of getting to the postseason, right? Because Mac will play 32 minutes for the starters down the stretch, right? But that kind of starts kicking into gear in January, usually like kind of mid to late January. So it's about getting there with a record that's good enough where you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and I don't think you saw any like tiredness down the stretch. Like the Baylor game, they shot the lights out of the ball. And granted, they shot terrible against San Diego State, but that was, I think, more just that team would do that every 5 games.
Right. Streaky team in 23. There was only one time where a singular loss followed a singular win, or vice versa, which when you have 13 losses on a season is pretty rare.
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's going to be less of that this year because I think you lost a component of why that was happening and hopefully gained an experienced person who keeps that kind of thing from happening.
Yeah.
We were 4-8 in games decided by 6 or less last year, so that's obviously...
I have questions about McDermott as a late game coach. I thought there were a couple games down the stretch where he was not good adjustment-wise.
I think there was some of that, and I think there's questions about his ability to draw up those late game plays.
Yeah.
Because I like we follow some of the X and O guys who document some of his play, right? Like clearly he is an offensive like mind, right? That's where he is. But down the stretch it does seem like we get away from a lot of our principles. We get away from a lot of the things that make our offense special. And we don't make the adjustments that we always need to get those buckets in the last 2 minutes.
Which is what pisses, and this isn't just a Creighton thing, this is a little side rant, but it pisses me the hell off. So, like, you kind of see it in football with, like, prevent defense, but, like, there's a minute and a half left, like, just run your fucking offense.
Yeah.
Like, if you take a wide open 3 on the shot clock with 15 seconds left, like, who cares? Like, make the shot.
Right. Well, and that's a great analogy because you see teams who just refuse. They'll rush 3.
Yeah, they'll rush 3.
And you just can't do that in this game anymore.
The amount of times you'll see a team up like 17-7 with like 3 minutes left in college football, go into prevent, give up a quick touchdown, run 3 times, punt, and give up a quick touchdown. So you gave up 7 points for 58. Like, Creighton, you're scoring 1.2 points per possession. It's a tied game with 45 seconds left. I don't give a shit. Like,
go get your basket.
Get your basket. Like, it pisses me the hell off.
So, a fun note here that I'll do now. If you had to guess, if there was no minimum on usage, who had the highest offensive rating in the conference last year by Torvik?
If there's no minimum?
No minimum.
Xander Yates solely for the St. John's game.
See, that's what I thought. It's Evan Young.
Okay.
Pick him up out of the KFC, huh?
Yeah.
Best O rating in the conference.
Yeah.
No
I'll also say we're not going to be able to spend this long on every team.
No, I know. We got it. I think the big few we'll get through.
Okay, so we're talking St. John's.
We're talking UConn, and we're talking about the defending national champions. Who, I mean, I kind of figured the metrics would be a little more down on them than they are. 3rd in Torvik, 4th in Ken Pom. A lot of it is projecting. The freshman year of Stephen Castle. I've never heard it pronounced, and Klingon coming off his freshman year. So I know you got thoughts.
Yeah,
Let's get to them.
You want me to just cook right now?
Let's go ahead.
Let's cook.
Let Dennis cook.
I have UConn picked 5th in the Big East. And before you say Dennis, that's fucking crazy. They won the title. They were dominant last year. What did they finish last year? They finished 4th last year. This is going to be a hot take. The UConn guy who asked that question, if you're still listening, like, get ready, pull out Twitter right now. Dan Hurley's not a good coach. I don't give a shit that he won a title. If Dan Hurley's a good coach because he won a title, let me know when the Kevin Ollie Hall of Fame ceremony is. I'll be sure to be there. Winning a title does not make you a great coach. That team was supremely talented. They were better than every single team they played. If you want to say, good job Hurley assembling that staff. Good job to him on that. He's not a good coach. They went 10-8 in conference last year. No, that would be right.
12-8.
12-8.
Yeah.
12-8 in conference year. There's no way that team should have lost.
Right, 13-7 because they finished.
They
with
lost
8
more
losses,
games than they should have.
Yeah, 13-7.
They lost more games than they should have. Dan Hurley is not a good coach. If you take away last year, he's made the second weekend 0 times. They were better than every team they played. You lose Sonogo, you lose Hawkins, you lose Jackson. Those are two top 45 draft picks. Where was Sonogo picked? Second round?
He's with the Bulls. I don't remember how that happened. He might have been undrafted. I don't remember for sure.
You lose 3 high-level professional. You lose your 3 best players last year.
Yeah, I mean Jackson you can debate on, but
he said Jackson was their most important player.
Yeah,
You lose your 3 best players.
He's the glue guy.
He's the glue.
Right?
You lost your 3 best players. Like, I have St. John's picked ahead of them. The fact that Iona was up on UConn at half last year, that's such an indictment of coaching. Like,
why? You say that like that doesn't happen to every
It's a fucking MAC team. It's a fucking... An NBA team should never be losing to a college team. That's the exact same skill difference as those 2 teams. That's a fucking MAC team. They were losing to St. Mary's at half.
Yeah, but again, are we going to say St. Mary's isn't a good team? Are we going to say that that's not just some of the randomness of college basketball?
If you give Bennett, UConn, and Hurley St. Mary's, Bennett is up by 25.
Maybe because honestly, I don't have that strong of an opinion on Hurley. But if you're going to say if they were up in the first half and then down in the second half, wouldn't that say he's making the adjustments?
Because talent won out. Eventually, talent won out.
But my point is, at what point is it talent? And at what point is it coaching? Because I think
That's strictly talent.
I seem to be lower than you based on the way we've talked about teams so far this year about how much coaching matters to an in-game result.
I think it matters.
Right, I'm saying I think less than you, that it actually impacts game to
So
game.
you want me to give Hurley credit for making an adjustment to beat a MAC team?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, can you criticize him for being down in the first half, for being down after 20 minutes of basketball against a team?
Yeah, but you'd criticize if Louisville came back and won by if Louisville came back and put up 6 points 2 days ago against Kentucky Wesleyan, you wouldn't say great adjustment, Kenny Payne. You'd say Kenny Payne, how the fuck is you beat them by 1 point?
It's not like it's that bad of a team though.
It's not. It's a MAC.
If they do that to Butler in conference play, do you even blink an eye at it?
No.
Right. So why is it different? It's in the tournament. You're getting every team's best punch.
That's not. There's. Butler's roster is infinitely better than Iona.
I'll admit, I don't remember anything from that game. Did Iona shoot 40% from 3 in the first half? There are a million things that can go into any single game, and that's one of those things where it's do analytics win out, or how much does actually winning the game matter, or how the game is won matter? They won every game by double digits in non-con.
Because they were so much more talented than any other team. Eventually, if that team didn't have a coach, I think they win the title. If you put those 10 guys out there and said, go play basketball, they win the title.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily disagreeing.
They were so much more talented than any team they played.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm just saying I don't know how little you can attribute to and say they'll be that much worse this year just because of that factor.
It's in conjunction with me having St. John's picked ahead of them.
Yeah, I just don't agree with that.
They lost their 3 best players. What have they done before last year when they had by far the best roster in college basketball?
You talk about the talents
if you
they've
give
wasted.
Bill Self that roster, that's talked about as an all-time great college basketball team.
That's true.
Bill Self goes 36-2 with that roster. Worst case scenario.
That's probably true. Yeah.
That team was they had everything.
Yep.
We said they lost their 3 best players. They still had a guy who averaged 20 a game the year before, and another top wing.
Yeah.
That team was so good. Their talent is not that good this year. I think there's going to be regression.
I want to say there will be, but at the same time, I look at the roster and I'm just going to spoil it. I picked them to win the conference.
I'm 5th.
Yeah. So clearly we differ here, and I just I think they got the right pieces they need too. I think Castle fills the hole with driving the ball. I think Spencer is a fantastic shooter. He was a great offensive player last year. On a bad Rutgers team, he put up a 120, right? So
he can't play defense.
He shoots 43%. At some point that just matters, right? We say that for our guys. He shoots 43%. Caravan shoots 40%. Newton's 37%, right? If Castle can shoot at all, then they're in the conversation for having 4 40-point guys surrounding a 7'4" center, right? Who, if he can stay on the floor at all, which
right? Preview. Do we want to get to that now?
Let's just get to that.
Yeah.
now.
Okay. So other mailbag question. You can say who was from whatever. Or we were going with the mailbag, right? 'Cause somebody asked.
Coach Ricky asked about the Klingon versus Kalkbrenner preseason ratings. Yeah.
Yep.
Why is it happening?
Yeah. All right. So I have some numbers for you. 2.1. 5.7. 2.3. And it closed me up, but I believe there it is. And 6.0. So those are Zach Eady's, Donovan Klingon, Ryan Kalkbrenner, and Hackathon Frederick King's foul rates.
Okay.
So going into last year, Edie was the big guy that everyone picked to make a jump. I was very against that.
Right.
I said I didn't get it at all. I was clearly wrong on that. Zach Edey doesn't foul. For as great as we talk about Ryan Kalkbrenner doesn't foul, Zach Edey's right there with him.
Yeah.
You know what? Donovan Klingon's foul rate is right in line with Fred King, who our fan base makes fun of for being the single biggest hack to ever step foot on a college basketball court.
Certainly a Creighton uniform.
They're right there. And now, the one argument I'll give is if you want to say Klingon knew he could use those fouls because he knew he only was only going to play 15 minutes a game.
Right.
That's the one argument I'll hear. But I don't think, because if you can defend a shot without fouling, just defend without fouling. You still put a guy at the line for 2 shots.
Right.
When you say if you looked at Edey the year before, I didn't think his body would hold up. But fouls weren't the issue. With Klingon, you also have the question of will his body hold up, which it's already kind of not. He's already
got a foot
dinged.
injury, yeah.
That's a foot injury. I know they say a month, maybe going to be back. When you're 7'2", that's not something that you can just water under the bridge. That's not how I, as a 6 foot, 200 pound, everyday individual, heals.
Yeah.
That's something you're scared of. And also, he's a fucking hack. Maybe he'll learn how to go straight up and defend without fouling this year, but is that going to make him less effective? So when you hear people automatically putting him against Kalkbrenner, when you hear people say Klingon's the 3rd best center in the country this year, it's you haven't seen him prove it.
Right.
He has to stay on the court. He has to do something he has not done. He has to do 2 things. One, he has to have that huge body, play big minutes. That's no easy task.
Yeah.
And 2, he has to play defense without fouling, which he has not done in college basketball.
Right. So, and that's where I absolutely agree with you in terms of preseason rankings need to stop guessing so much, right? And they don't mean anything, right? Seeing CBK report put him second in play in center's return.
I'd almost argue the biggest vote in favor of Kalkbrenner is if Andy Katz has Klingon first.
Well, we better check that. People are starting to realize how terrible Andy Katz is.
Yeah, fucking.
But no, so that's absolutely true, and you underrate too, teams that can get up and down. You forget just how good Kalkbrenner is at getting up and down the floor with ease, right? He does not tire. He plays 32 minutes a game in a fast-paced offense. He has no problem with it.
When he doesn't have mono.
Klingon's got to prove that, and UConn's got to prove some things, right? Because, I'll fully admit, it's a gamble on this one. They should regress. They do not have a single returning player that had more than 10.1 points per game for them last year.
Yep.
And that's Newton, and most of his points came there was a point last season where they couldn't play Newton, right? Where they were mix matching him with Diarra and Aline, I think, because they were all unplayable. He came on late in the season, and I think that's more the kind of player he is than what was early in the season, but it's not a guarantee. Their bench is entirely unproven. Super talented, but entirely unproven. So Diarra is a negative on offense, but he's a plus on defense. So at least he's a 0. Samson Johnson, they've been talking about a couple off seasons now. I'll be interested to see him. 6'10", bit of a power forward center kind of built, so he'll spare Klingon. And then Solomon Ball, I think he's top 25 freshman coming off the bench. So they've got a lot of proving to do for a team that won a national championship last season.
Yeah, and one other point I'll make, and just when you were talking about it now, it kind of jumped out to me, but the Big Ten also plays significantly slower than the Big East will.
Yeah.
Like, Creighton's going to want to get up and down. Like, I think St. John's going to want to get up and down a little bit. Marquette's going to want to get up and down. Like, it's also another thing for Edie. Like, when you're playing Wisconsin, who's going to take 28 seconds every time they're coming up and down the court. Like, you're playing Nebraska, who's going to take 28 seconds. Like, it's also easier for, again, as a huge big man to log big minutes.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Again, like, if looking back at the end of the year, like, if Klingon is the first-team All-American, like, he is what people said they were, like, I can see it happening. I just don't get why, and we'll get into this nationwide. It's like the Tyrese Proctor thing. Like, you just assume he's gonna start doing stuff that he hasn't done yet.
I got thoughts on that, on him specifically when we get into our national preview in a future episode. Yeah, but yeah, I'm buying UConn because I'm buying Castle. I think Caravan is the most underrated player in the conference. I think he's huge, 40% shooter, and made them all in big moments. Right, like when he had to have them, he had them. Stretches the floor nicely. I think Spencer's an underrated ad, and I think Klingon will give you 22 great minutes, and I think that's good enough. I think that's good enough for this team to be successful. And I'm talking like I have them, I think, like 15-5, us 14-6, Marquette 14-6. Right? Like, I'm not saying it's going to be like a wide margin. I think they just maybe get that one extra win that gives them the regular season. All right, so Nova.
That was a good job by us, by the way, of not taking as long on the last team.
Yep. That we might have spent 12 minutes on that one.
It was 15.
Yeah. So Kyle Neptune is still the coach at Villanova, and ultimately that's why this is not a top 10 team. Do we agree on that?
Maybe.
Because we had this discussion a week or two ago where we said, like, this is the kind of roster where if you look at it and Jay Wright's the coach, I mean, I'll just go through it. Senior, Justin Moore. Senior, TJ Bamba. Senior, Tyler Burton. Senior, Hakeem Hart. Senior, Eric Dixon. You'd look at that under Jay Wright and you'd say, uh-oh, right? Like, here comes trouble. 4 new players, or basically 4 new players in the starting lineup because Moore missed most of last season, right? But that's a damn good thing for a team that went 17-7 and played its best ball the last 2 weeks of the season.
17.
That's what, sorry, yeah. I think people forget too easily that Moore's ceiling is National Player of the Year.
Yep.
I'll spoil a prediction. He's my Big East Player of the Year this season.
Okay.
I think he has to be great on the team that year, and he will be. His numbers are a little lower than I remember, like only 34% from 3.
Last year.
Yeah, and before that I think was only like 35 or 36.
Yeah.
Just feels like he's always a dagger guy. And he takes a lot of like challenge threes too.
Yeah.
They're not always gimmies.
I think with Moore, you see, like more specifically, unless you're doing ayahuasca, like Achilles injuries normally take like 2 years to really come back from. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't surprise me to see a lot of the efficiency numbers come up. Because like when he came back last year, he was still only 10 months removed. Like that happened
It was
in
early.
the Elite Eight.
Yes.
Like the injuries. So like it wasn't like expecting him to be 100% wasn't full strength.
And he was still an impact player.
Yeah, he still was very good.
So of the ads, like Burton's the one who put up the highest numbers. I also think he's probably the one that might be the least likely to start if they try to do Mark Armstrong as a true point guard. I mean, he was brutal last year, but they could at least expect the sophomore jump out of him. Bamba's probably the most interesting piece as a weapon, 38% from 3, averaged 16 a game for a pretty rough Washington State team last year, but at least you know he played against good competition. Eric Dixon is, we know what Eric Dixon is, right? If he's making threes, he's as tough to stop as anybody in the country, but as a pure big, he's maybe not an impact player. Like, he can give guys trouble, but he ain't going to go win games by himself if he's not making threes.
Can I come to the defense of Kyle Neptune?
Good luck.
Is it possible that, like, so for those of you who don't know, so Kyle Neptune, longtime Villanova assistant, 1 year at Fordham where they went 16-16, which that's a pretty good year for that program.
It would have been.
Finished Finished 173rd in KenPom, left to take the Nova job after 1 year. That was his first year as a head coach. Keith Ergo, the assistant at Fordham under Neptune, who then got the job off of Neptune leaving, went 25-8 last year, finished 137th in KenPom. So that, coupled with Nova's worst year in recent memory, a lot of people down on Kyle Neptune. I'm not exactly sure that's fair. Like, we just talked with Creighton and said, like, oh, like, how many teams could lose their best player and still be good. Villanova was down their 2 best players, and like, I understand Moore played. Like, that wasn't Justin Moore that you saw in 21. That's not the Justin Moore you're going to see in 23. Like,
Yeah.
that was Justin Moore 10 months off of an Achilles injury. Cam Whitmore, who was supposed to be their guy, 5-star top 10 recruit, barely played.
What do you mean barely
He
played?
missed like the first 2 months of the season. He missed games. Here.
Yeah,
Like,
I was
he
going
didn't
to say,
play.
he played the whole conference.
He didn't play. I think he still missed some games in conference.
Well, we only played him at the end of this. We played him 3 times in like 3 weeks, so I
Yeah.
guess that's fair. I don't remember too much of their season.
So like, if you want to give Ergo credit for going 25-8, and for all you Fordham fans, here you go, bonus A10 preview. Like,
Yeah,
does
A10 was-
Neptune not get a little credit for putting the foundation in place to go 25-8? Like,
Well, and we say like there's a reason Jay Wright basically picked him, right? Like I trust him to say like, all right, at least this guy knows what he's doing.
yeah, and this isn't. I'm not putting Neptune on the same level as Patino. I'm not putting him on the same level as McDermott. But like, and I myself have said this, like, if Nova had a better coach, like, I'd have them. I'd have them number 1 in the conference. Like, are we sure a guy in his second year as head coach who is missing his 2 best players for a majority of the year, like, isn't a good coach? Like,
I think it's the way they lost and who they lost to a lot of
Yeah,
times.
they
Like
lost
they
to bad
would
teams.
just capitulate against Georgetown, right? Like just broke into pieces in the second half of that game.
yeah,
Like I think that sticks in a lot of people's memories as like, damn, you're still Villanova. Like you're you know, and I think it's actually there's some fairness to it, right? Because you were relying on a guy like Armstrong, Legino, Patterson, and they just did not pan out. And those are right recruits, right? So it's it's how much of, well, he's kind of in this situation, and yeah, they didn't have the same roster turnover that new coaches usually get. But is that his fault? Sometimes inheriting a roster of guys that aren't your guys isn't always a good thing. So they lose Daniels, Slater, and Whitmore, who honestly I don't think any of them were impact players last year for the most part.
no, I think Whitmore was a huge disappointment. Yeah, I don't think it's a huge deal. I think they return a lot of talent. I have them picked 4th.
Yeah, I mean, I do too.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the gap is smaller between them and the top than it is between a lot of the other teams in that like 5 to 7 range.
I have a clear top 5.
Yeah, and I'm more of a top 4.
Yep.
And again, we'll get to that. All right, we'll go through one more team here, and we'll go through the last probably. Well, we might end part 1 here because I think we want to talk about St. John's and Providence in conjunction. So
Yeah.
this we'll close part 1 here. We'll get back to you with part 2.